Welcome everyone to Pairing Pages. Thank you for joining us. Today I will be speaking to Jessica Moor, author of Young Women. And we're going to be discussing the book in detail, as well as picking up on a few themes in the book, which I'll then be pairing to 3 wines from the Argentinian producer Catena. Today, those wines are the Catena Chardonnay High Mountain Vines. We've got the Catena Malbec 2019 High Mountain Vines as well. And finally, we'll have the 2018 Catena Alta Historic Rose Malbec. So very exciting. So crack open a glass of wine. What are you drinking today at the moment, Jessica?
Oh, I'm not. I have got a good Malbec on the go, actually, which a friend bought for me as a book launch present, so it's become like my motif, I think.
Perfect. Well, it is mentioned quite a lot in the book, Malbec, yeah, which we'll get onto. And before we start, we just kind of want to have a quick recap of the book. So it is about 2 young women, as the name suggests, who strike up a friendship which burns really bright and fast. That's how I best describe it. So there's Emily, who is a lawyer, and she works for a women's advocacy group. She calls herself a rule-abiding little creep, her own words. And Tamsin, who is an actress, really kind of enigmatic, dazzling, seemingly self-assured, oozing cool and confidence, kind of the friend we always kind of want to be and are a bit jealous of, really. The book explores the birth, life, and death, really, of that friendship from the viewpoint of Emily. And whilst doing so, also explores the issues of sexual harassment, trauma, power dynamics, the Me Too movement, feminism, dating of feminists, social activism, justice, and basically everything that makes me want to smash the patriarchy. So you've fanned my feminist flames, Jessica. Welcome. And before we really kind of get into it, could you just tell us a little bit more about you?
So Young Women is my second novel. I wanted to be a writer since I was about 5. I wrote my first short story, which was about a cat that got stuck up a tree. Happy ending, which was probably my first and only happy ending. I studied English literature, then I kind of went off and did lots of those kind of odd jobs that you often do when you leave university. So I worked in the cultural sector, I worked in the women's sector. I thought I might want to be a psychotherapist, actually. I'm very interested in kind of the dynamics and what's really going on deep down under the surface for people. But I thought that would possibly be a little bit unethical, because I would always secretly be wanting to write about anyone who I worked with. So I thought, given the ethics of that, I should just accept my fate and try and be a writer. So I wrote my first novel, Keeper. That came out in 2020, a good 4 days before all the bookshops shut for lockdown.
Oh no!
So that wasn't ideal, but luckily it was all kind of to the good, because I managed to, instead of running it around having fun in the summer of 2020, I instead wrote a book about some young women running around and having fun. And as you touched on, the book does sort of deal with some heavy themes, but I kind of I think of it very much as a fun book. It's about, as you say, this intense female friendship, and a lot of the the core and the heart of the book is about these 2 girls who kind of see each other, they see how much they need each other, and they just have a great time. And I wish that I could have just carried on writing them having a great time for the whole book, but unfortunately that's not really how narrative works. But yeah, that's me. I kind of have a feminist underpinning to a lot of my writing. I'm interested in violence against women, in structural barriers that women face, and the way that all those sort of seemingly quite disparate issues kind of can all interconnect, and how we can tackle that, not just with policy. I wish I were a policymaker, but I don't think I have the right constitution for that. So the tools of my trade, the way I understand the world and the way that I think, is through stories. So that's what I do.
It's really interesting there that you said that you would have been a psychologist. I can so see that in this kind of really deep down inside. And the fact that you wrote it in lots of, had the idea, put it down, edited it, drafted it, redrafted it, and then finished it in lockdown puts me to shame, Jessica.
Look, anyone who got through lockdown has smashed it. And like, honestly, it wasn't like me kind of thinking, oh, I better go and do something. There's maybe a little bit of like that kind of industrious side to me that's reflected in one of the characters. But really, it was more like, I really miss my mates, and I really miss going out and eating lovely food and drinking lovely wine, and I can't do that right now, so I'm just going to write about other people doing it. So it was my way to have fun in that crappy summer where fun was in short supply.
And I think obviously you wrote this with that in mind. I think it's very interesting that it is launching currently right now, because despite women making up half of the population, our issues are seen as niche, due to the default male. And the Me Too movement, in the press at least, has kind of seemed to quieten down. But obviously, recently, we've been inundated with the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp case. Now, I'm not getting into it, particularly what's being said in the case. I just think it's a very interesting moment for this to come about. From reading the comments that people have been making on both sides of that case, and kind of seeing that reflected in what the characters are saying and what they're going through and what they have to deal with. So very interesting.
And regardless of what went on in that marriage, which obviously neither of us know and none of us know, and it's good to remember that none of us know, but you do not need to know what went on in that marriage to know that misogyny is alive and well, based on how it's been reported. And it is interesting because, like I said, I worked in the domestic violence sector, and what people have kind of struggled to understand is that a lot of these dynamics are playing out, like the whole situation is actually completely textbook. Like it's not surprising at all. So it's been interesting, but we won't go into it.
Exactly.
We don't want to get bogged down in.
It was more just an observation for me, having read those comments, and I'm sure many people watching would have been reading those comments, to read this book with that in mind. So there we go. So yes, let's start kind of the very first page really of the book, and you quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, Dirty Hands, which was used in Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. And I'll just read it. Half victims, half accomplices, like everyone else. Now, in that book, obviously, she discusses the treatment of women throughout history. And I'm interested, because actually for me, I didn't quite get why you did that until the end. And then it was like, yes, I've got it. But why was it important for you to use that? Why did you choose that as kind of the, phrase you wanted to hang? So
that was literally the quote that I pinned up above my desk while I was writing. And the working title of the book was actually Half Accomplice. And my first novel was all about victimhood. It's about women who were, undisputedly victims of domestic violence. And then I kind of went on and did a lot of reading about the Weinstein case. And I thought it was fascinating the way that a lot of his enablers were women. And women who understood what was going on and understood that it was wrong. And I just thought it was very interesting. The reason I like that quote is because it says, like everyone else. So it's not pointing a finger. It's not saying these are the perpetrators and these are the victims. I think that the line between victim and perpetrator kind of runs through every human heart. I think that most people who harm others do so because at some point they have been harmed themselves. Also, a lot of the kind of subtlest and most sticky things about abuse is that abusers make their victims complicit. Like they make them kind of keep the secret. And it was really something, when I was researching this book, I mean, it's going to get a little dark, but I was watching the documentaries about the Michael Jackson case. And one of the things he did with those children was have them take part in like a sort of pseudo wedding ceremony, so that they felt like they were secret keepers for him. And that's kind of the playbook. That's what people who are kind of misusing their power over others do. They kind of subcontract out their control to the person they're harming. And a lot of the time, you know, whenever we've found ourselves, you know, in a situation maybe where we've been harmed, what we end up doing is blaming ourselves. And that's also counterproductive, because that's never true. It's never your fault if someone harmed you. But at the same time, I find it so interesting that we need that binary. We long for this idea that there's a clear group of victims and a clear group of perpetrators. And if we just accept that it's everyone, and that we all have ways in which we are complicit with harm, and we all have ways in which we are harmed, then we can maybe get a little bit less judgmental about it. I mean, obviously there are people who are doing serious harm and they have committed crimes, but there's no point scapegoating. It's the question is, what am I doing to allow harm to be done either to myself or to someone else? And that doesn't mean it's my fault, but how do I unpick myself on this? And that's not that the reason that I think that the novel is such a great medium is that it doesn't try and point fingers. That's not the point. The point is to tell a story and make people real, and make your reader literally just put themselves in the shoes of someone who maybe does something they don't agree with. And so we get to kind of experiment with other people's emotional realities. And that was what I kind of wanted to encapsulate, this idea of half victim, half accomplice, because I felt like that speaks to how I feel. I know that I'm harmed by patriarchy. I also know that in some ways I uphold patriarchy, you know, and if women didn't uphold patriarchy, it'd probably be gone by now.
Absolutely. I know you kind of mentioned there about judgment and you know, how we each other as women will interact with other women and whatnot, and we will be getting onto that a little bit further down, but yes, so we'll get into that. But I just kind of wanted to jump a little bit back to the beginning, and the book starts with the women being arrested at a climate protest.
Yeah.
So why was it important for you to choose that setting? Why climate justice?
Because at the back of my mind, with every issue that we face right now, I kind of feel like if we don't solve climate, then all of this is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. You know, like if we don't...
What a phrase! Whoa!
I mean,
wow!
Like I, you know, we, and it doesn't mean that other things aren't important, but so they meet, Emily and Tamsin meet at this protest, and Tamsin is there because she cares about the environment, and then she kind of gets pulled into this other problem, this other injustice, and she has the opportunity to kind of be a poster child for a different fight, but that's the fight that's important to her. And I kind of think maybe she's right about that. I also just felt like it's so emblematic of a particular moment and like a particular mindset that a lot of us have, this kind of constant low-level fear and anxiety about climate. Every time when I was drafting the book, every time that I was starting to write kind of, oh, the character is feeling depressed, I didn't say they were depressed, I just said that they were looking at environmental news. And climate was definitely on my mind when I was working on the book. you know, we had the pandemic kind of hit us like a hurricane, and it showed us that when we really want to, we can actually kind of mobilize really quickly and make massive changes. And we have decided to do that on some things, but on other things we remain inactive. And it was really kind of seeping into my consciousness that this remains this like background emergency that is always there, and it lends like this sense of importance, but also frustration to every other issue, because it's like, well, what if we solve inequality? If we don't solve the fact the planet's on fire, then none of it matters.
We're all equally dead.
We're all equally dead. But then we're not equally dead, are we? Because some people will fry quicker.
Yes.
Climate was really important in the book. It's like a real sort of it's like the water they're swimming in, this sense of, and I also think it's a bit of a generational thing, like growing up, you know, millennials and Gen Z growing up with this looming prospect, like that does something to our psyches.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with the anxiety, you know, outside of this, I've definitely started to become a bit more anxious of the environment, so I can completely understand that. And I guess it also adds, like, I don't know, a bit of visceral pace to it all on top of what's happening. You know, we're kind of putting a deadline and a time onto it. Yeah. So and was it important that Emily and Tamsin were from different countries for you? So Tamsin is Canadian.
She's Canadian.
Then she goes to America, Connecticut, and obviously Emily is English. So I just wonder, was that a conscious decision for you, for them to meet in London but coming from different backgrounds?
Well, that kind of one of the interesting bits to that is that my partner is Canadian. So like, I don't know why that part of him kind of seeped into Tamsin, but I was very comfortable like writing that rhythm of conversation of a Canadian versus a British person. It was very important that Tamsin be other, that she, you know, is kind of to use a very loaded word, like exotic. But also that she's can't be pinned down. She's not really any one thing, because she's Canadian, but her heritage is lots of different places. She speaks different languages. She's kind of this real mishmash, and she's just not something that Emily can feel comfortable pigeonholing, because Emily, I think, feels a lot of frustration that she lives in a sort of certain type of I don't know, like millennial London setup, and knows a certain type of woman, and she feels very stuck with the people that she knew when she was growing up, and then suddenly this sort of rare exotic bird, like, you know, comes flying into her life. So yeah, the difference between them is very important. Not sure why she's Canadian as opposed to American. I think also it's because she speaks French and English, so it was that sense of doubleness to her, that she could be elusive, and Emily thinks she's American. Now it turns out she's Canadian, and so she's not what she first appears in any sense, and she's just got that little bit of elusiveness, like she doesn't have a set story of who she is.
And you end their first meeting and the first chapter with a sentence that on the surface of it sounds so innocuous, but actually it really is kind of the chorus call of the end of an evening for any woman, right? Will you text me when you get home? Yeah. And it's so, that really struck out to me, because I was like, oh yeah, of course. And then you really say, because that's what women do. And you really, even just in that moment, thinking that already starts the conversation, right? Why are women having to think? Why is that already a thing that is so ingrained in us that we have to do? And actually, that brings me on to the first theme that I want to pair a wine with, and that is resilience and adaptability. So, you know, when we're reading the book, it really is about different reactions to events. And kind of whatever's happened means that women know to say that phrase. What's happened in the past means that, you know, in the book, for instance, Emily contacts the police when she's been sexually harassed on the tube, or Tamsin decides to keep quiet, or some of the other victims of the director decide to band together and go on the front of Vogue, and Amina moves back to Senegal. And it's all about how different women are resilient and they adapt and move forward with what they've had to deal with.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm pairing it, I'm going to be pairing it with the Catena 2020 Chardonnay. And that's because Chardonnay is really well known for being an adaptable grape. So it's actually one of the reasons why it's so widely grown across the world. It's just, you can put it anywhere and it will take the characteristics of that country or that place. So for instance, in warm countries, you'll get really nice stone fruit, or slightly colder countries, you'll get citrus. Takes oak, doesn't want oak. Either way, it will kind of always find its place and, you know, steady itself. And this particular Chardonnay is grown at high altitude, so it's at 3,000, you know, the vineyards are at 3,000 feet and above. And I don't want to get too technical, but essentially for every 100
please get technical.
100 meters up you go, it gets cooler by 0.6 degrees. You know, so that means it's a lower temperature, and actually that makes the wine more intense. And there's a wine term called like purity of fruit, but because it's colder, essentially it just means that those, you can get more crystal clear notes and aromas, which, you know, here we're getting a bit of pineapple and a bit of kind of mandarin and a little bit of stone fruit. And it also means that there's acidity, so there's a real backbone, that like dribbling sensation you get when you have a glass of wine is the acidity. And I just think that's really like, you know, what these women have to deal with, you know, that acidic backbone. Whatever happens to women, and it happens to so many women. Actually, the UN Women UK did a report that said that 97% of 18 to 24-year-olds have been sexually harassed. So essentially, we're talking about all women. And whatever happens, you know, we have to grow a backbone, a bit similar to that acidity and that structure. And, you know, we get a little bit more refined, more in tune to what's kind of happening, or always that person, or, you know, we maybe become more sensitive to things. So I think that was really what I wanted to pair, that idea of having to adapt, having to become resilient to this grape and this wine. So that is the Catena High Mountain Vines Chardonnay. And I just, you know, and also for you, why was it important for you to include so many different reactions? You know, we go from rape, you know, with Tamsin, to a touch on the tube, to kind of, you know, the whole symphony of sexual harassments are kind of really touched on in the book. Why was it important for you to include all of those and not just one, say?
I think it comes down to this struggle that we kind of have to get together sort of some coherent story of what's really happening. Like, you can kind of form an idea of, okay, this is what rape is. But then if you link that to something that can happen so casually and can happen every day, and there's no real recourse, then that shifts the story. It stops being this kind of crime, this thing that we can kind of separate and split off from the rest of our sort of psyche, and becomes something we've got to sort of incorporate. And because it is everywhere, you know, sometimes you just have one of those really bad weeks. I find it often happens in clusters. Marissa Bate was talking about the reason she started the Everyday Sexism Project was just she had a really bad week where 3 different things happened. And if any one of those things had happened by themselves, then maybe she wouldn't have thought it was such a big deal. But there does seem to sometimes be these, like, you know, you have a day where suddenly you get catcalled, and then someone, you know, says something really nasty, or you know, or you get talked down to by your, I don't know, male boss, or someone in the gym says something, and it does sort of start to form into this story, and you make the connections, and Emily would be making the connections because of the work that she's doing. And that was something that I definitely had when I was working in the domestic violence sector. Just like, you would be reading none of these awful cases of you know, homicide, and then you'd go and have a drink with your friend, and she'd be talking about her new boyfriend and how he, you know, he just kept checking up on her quite a lot. And you'd be thinking, okay, there's a link between what I've been looking at work and what's happening here, and I have a choice about how I respond to this. And you worry so much because you worry about trying to respond the best possible way, and you take it on, you think, how am I going to solve this? And the truth is, you can't. So it's that enormousness that I wanted to convey, that sense that often it's kind of everywhere you turn, and very often it'll happen when you're having a really good day. And I was thinking about, well, what is street harassment the other day, and I was thinking, what it is it's sexual bullying. It's just somebody with that exactly that same impulse as a playground bully, just seeing someone thinking, I'm going to make them feel small because I feel small. And I wanted to convey that sense that you can be having the loveliest day with your friend, and then suddenly the bubbles popped. And that does something to your psyche. It does something to your sense of being allowed to enjoy yourself in an unfettered, unencumbered way. And that was important because so much of the book is about enjoyment. Like, it is about people, young women, having fun. And I want, you know, I do kind of feel like I need to say that, because it sounds like it's just this kind of lurching from one horrible episode to another. But
no, they get drunk and tipsy and have a good old time.
They get drunk loads and have a lovely time, but there is that sense that, you know, you're a young girl, you're out getting drunk with your friend. If something happened on the way home, people would blame you.
Well, yes, quite.
So counterbalancing that, like, joy and freedom, and, you know, what does freedom look like on a sort of the level of going out and being in the street, versus kind of the bigger freedoms that we have as modern women, which is the freedom to kind of respond to our circumstances, to control our lives, hopefully, to some extent, and the complexity of that.
And you obviously have mentioned there that you previously were working for in the domestic violence sector. Was this book actually quite therapeutic for you to write then? I hesitate to say that writing is therapeutic, because to me, like, writing is work. Like, not in the sense of, like, it's, you know, it's hard graft, but, like, there's a craft to it. And I think that the difference between writing your diary and writing a novel is that with a novel you're thinking about effect. What tends to happen is I get very upset about something in the world, and this certainly was the case with my first novel, and then I write about it, and it's not that I'm working through my thoughts, because I kind of have them already, but after I've written the book, I kind of am able to separate myself from that issue a bit more. It doesn't obsess me in the same way. It's definitely almost me sort of downloading some part of myself into the book so that I can be free. I don't feel weighed down by these sort of thoughts anymore, because I'm quite obsessive. I get quite obsessed with things. I mean, I guess the thing is that this is, you're writing and downloading about an issue that once you've written it still exists. You're still having to deal with it. Has it made you think any differently then? Now that you've written it down, you've kind of, as you said, not got it out of your system, but explained it. Did the process of writing it and actually trying to think of the different perspectives and how the different characters deal with things, has it made your perspectives change on anything?
Yes, I think so. From the beginning of writing to the end of writing, because I think I now just have more sympathy for both Emily and Tamsin, because without giving spoilers, they both make decisions that are a lot of people, a lot of readers would not agree with.
Mm-hmm.
They do things that I hope I wouldn't do, but I don't know if I would do them, but you know, I might. And I have now an immense amount of understanding for why people do what they do. But with that said, I also kind of force my characters to deal with the consequences of their actions. Like I don't think that, you know, every choice is fine and they can do whatever they want, and that's freedom. I think that you know, there's a choice that Tamsin makes, and in the end of the book we find her in a play playing Desdemona and Othello, and as some will know, Desdemona gets killed at the end of Othello, and there's a reason why I chose that part for her to play. She chose to not change something, and it's fine. It's okay to not change things, and that might be the right choice for you as a person. But if you don't choose to make a change, then you're going to end up playing Desdemona. You don't get to end up breaking out of those old roles and those old ways of doing things because you haven't done something different. You can't keep doing the same thing and expect different results. And that's true for patriarchy as it is for, you know, anything else. So yeah, I think my understanding of their situation changed, but I don't just because I understand their choices more doesn't mean that I don't think they were the wrong choices.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you actually do say, Tamsin says, you know, doesn't she? Does that make me a good or a bad person?
Yeah.
Or whatnot? So, and that's the thing, we're humans, we're fallible, we're not black, you know, things aren't black and white, they are grey.
And the point of a novel is not to write about really brilliant people making wonderful choices.
Yeah.
That would be really boring to me.
Yeah, and not realistic at all. So, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And as you've mentioned, you know, it might have seemed like it was a bit of a downer, but this book is fundamentally actually a book about friendship and fun, as you say. And of course, there's the main friendship between Emily and Tamsin, but then also there's Lucy as well. And as we mentioned, you know, they're all dealing with things in different ways. And Tamsin, you know, Emily actually does say quite a few times in the book, like, oh, what would Tamsin do in this situation? How can I act like that? And then she also refers to what the old Lucy, so Lucy is a friend that she's known for ages, you know, since they were in school, and Emily refers to Lucy, you know, like the old Lucy's gone, and she kind of misses how they used to be able to have fun and confide in a little bit. Each other a little bit more back in the days. And that's actually what I've decided to pair my second one with, the theme of community and friendship. And I am pairing that with the 2019 Catena Malbec High Mountain Vines. And the reason for that is this is actually a blend of 3 plots, and I just thought it made perfect sense with there being kind of that Lucy, Emily and Tamsin. But each site has a different elevation, it's on different soils, and you know, and that means that each of those grapes grown in those sites have different tastes, they have different strengths, different weaknesses. So I just thought it was really good, you know, match to go with it. But kind of aside from that, I think, you know, community is above and beyond, you know, it's also community I want to touch on, not just friendship. And the thought that, you know, there's that really famous saying, isn't there? You are the sum of the 5 people around you, and you touch on kind of men and other friends and the responsibility we have to women, other women as well. So yeah, that is what I kind of wanted to pair with this, which is, you'll know, because the book, they drink a lot of Malbec in here, and obviously earlier you said Malbec has become a bit of a good luck charm for you. So lovely plum and damson and, oh, just beautiful dark fruits and a little bit of graphite on there. It's delicious. I'm making you a bit jealous that you've not got your glass out there, Jessica.
Furious.
So,
Love Malbec.
Kind of talking a little bit more about the community and friendship aspect then.
Yeah.
Why was it important for you to include Lucy?
Why was it important for me to include Lucy?
Because she's really the antithesis of Tamsin.
Well, yes. That's why it was important for me to include Lucy. No, it was a few things. It was that sense of trying to shake off the person he used to be, but also there being this reminder, which is this person near you. I wanted to write about old friendships and the way that I think sometimes when you've sort of grown up with someone and they've always been your peer, anywhere where you diverge can feel quite weird and almost quite painful. And I think sometimes when we're very enmeshed with our friends, we see their choices as kind of a judgment on our choices. The fact that Lucy's kind of got this very stable life. She's a teacher. She's got a lovely solid boyfriend. They're buying a flat in Croydon. And I think that, that those are all perfectly good things for a person to do, but Emily feels like they're a judgment on her. She feels like she's failed to live up to the standard of being Lucy, but also kind of slightly looks down on Lucy's choices, which is, it's that complexity, how we feel about ourselves, and the way that we kind of sometimes latch parts of our personality onto different friends, and she can't quite value Lucy for who she is. I think she wants her to be someone slightly different, and so when this kind of shiny new friend comes along and it's Tamsin and she's all fabulous and has none of that kind of, well, it is community, isn't it, but none of that sense of being embedded in her life and embedded in her personal history. She's just this kind of alien who's just landed in the middle of her life. She finds that incredibly seductive because she is running from something. And Lucy also represents, we were talking about being half accomplice. Lucy represents the guilt of that, because there was something that happened with Lucy and Emily didn't do anything about it. And she didn't know that it was wrong, but she didn't do anything. And so she became an accomplice, and Lucy became an accomplice when they were just young girls. And that's what happens. And I wanted to write about that sense of sometimes re-evaluating something that happened in our lives when we have more understanding of people and power dynamics and all those things. Lucy seems to have kind of moved on, and so Emily is very kind of happy to put her in a box and say, she's fine now. There was no problem there. And again, it's that complexity. It's things not being what they seem, and the past will circle back and come and haunt you, and all those sort of thorninesses and difficulties about being a young woman. I thought were well explored through their friendship.
So the final theme I want to discuss and pair is the future. So I'm going to be pairing that with this, which is the Catena Zapata 2018 Historic Rose Malbec. And ironically, even though I'm discussing the future, I've paired it with a wine that is based in the past. So a little bit of wine history here. So Nicola Catena actually planted Malbec back in 1902, kind of was known for revolutionizing the Argentine wine industry. And these particular grapes are grown from Malbec on what's called ungrafted vines. Now stay with me. In the late 19th century, there was this thing called the Phloxera Epidemic, which are teeny little insects that destroyed basically 9/10 of all of the vineyards in Europe. And that's because this little insect was introduced to Europe via botanists that brought it from America, and the vines in America were resistant to this insect, whereas the vines in England weren't. So in order to get around that now, most grapes are what we call grafted. So they will have American rootstock, which are resistant to the Phloxera, and then we'll have like the European grapes on top of it. And Malbec actually originally comes from France, so it is a European grape originally. However, this particular wine is on ungrafted rootstocks. So, you know, it really has an authentic connection to the past, you know, and it takes the past because it's still got its original rootstocks, and it grows and it gets deeper and stronger each year. And I don't know if you've ever seen old vines, but they get really gnarly and strong, and, you know, just, you can tell they're just sturdy and steady and they've got a strong foundation. So I really wanted to pair this wine because it's like from the past, from what we've learned, is what we need to take on to move to the future. So that's why I've paired it with this with the Catena Alta historic rose, because I think from the past we learn to the future. So then I will ask you, how do you think we can push this conversation forward? I mean, we've kind of touched upon it in the rest of the conversation, but, you know, what do we need to do? What do we, you know, women, men, everyone in between, how do we go forward?
I think we need to get off social media. Social media crops up in the book, and that's because I think I wanted to kind of think about how that kind of poisons the well and poisons the discourse, and I don't think any good conversation is going to be had on Twitter when we're all screaming at each other, and like that will require some reparative work. Like, we'll need to learn to disagree again, we'll need to learn to listen again and to not whittle down our opinions into things that can be expressed in 280 characters. So that would be what I would do first. I think we need to be curious about why people do what they do. You know, and I love like all the kind of the history that you're talking about with the wine, because it's this sense of, well, everything that's been done, like people have done it for a reason, and it might seem weird. Why, you know, why are we grafting like plants onto other plants? Actually, no, in context, it makes sense. And usually, when you understand the context of what someone's done, it was what was best for them at the time. So I think we need to be interested in other people's stories. And I do think that we need to talk about responsibility as well as freedom. You know, I think we talk about freedom a lot. Like what should women be allowed to do? Like, am I allowed to do this as a feminist? Am I allowed to, I don't know, get a Brazilian wax or change my name or wear high heels? You know, you're allowed to do anything you want. Like, that's the beauty of being a woman in the 21st century. And, you know, in certain societies, you are allowed to do whatever you want. And that's great. But what do you owe to other women? And that's like a kind of an old-fashioned question in a way. Like, the whole idea of community and owing each other something feels quite radical because it is quite old-fashioned. It's the idea that you're not an island. Your choices affect other people, and that doesn't mean that you don't have the right to make your choices. It doesn't mean you don't have the right to live like your best life. But what does that mean for other people? Yeah, what are your responsibilities to other people? And I think that if we were to kind of have a bit more introspection about that, then maybe that kind of impulse to like tear each other down and judge each other and work out who's the most evil, maybe that would all fall away. I mean, this is very utopian, but I don't necessarily think any of those things will happen. But if, like, in terms of what would make the conversation about the future better, then that's what I think. And that it also comes back to that thing that we were talking about earlier about the environment. We have wrecked an ecosystem. We wrecked all our, we've wrecked so many ecosystems, and now things are going haywire because we didn't have respect for like the biodiversity of our world, and now some repair is going to be necessary, and that comes back to like what we were talking about, community and responsibility, and finding joy in that as well. They sounds heavy, but there's a lot of happiness to be found in like cultivating community. Yeah,
and actually it actually brings me into another great point about the wine and pairing with this theme. So because it's an old historic vine, what happens is the yield, so how many grapes are on a bunch, are greatly reduced. So the fruit, the flavor concentration in each grape is so intense, and it's spot on with what you were saying about, kind of getting off social media, getting rid of the distractions, really focusing yourself. What is it that's important? You were talking about the environment, stop using the chemicals, going back to basics, stripping it down to the simples. It's exactly like what these historic rows are doing, really. They're just focusing on those few, but doing them very well and intensely. So, and that's really, it matches really well.
And finding, like joy, pleasure, whatever in a moment, rather than sort of always looking for what to be anxious about and what's going wrong. Maybe just sit with a friend, have a lovely glass of wine.
Yes, like they do in the book many a time.
And enjoy those good times, because bad things will happen, as we all learned. But that just means you've got to enjoy those moments where everything's okay even more.
I think actually that's a really nice, in the book, I know Emily says to Tamsin, actually quite early on, when they're discussing what Emily does, and she discusses her work in women's advocacy, and says, they don't win every case, but they carry on doing it, and it's worth carry on doing it, because even if it's just to keep the idea of justice alive until a better time comes. And I love that sentence. I really love that sentence.
Thank you.
And I guess that's what that's the whole book and what we're talking about is, right? Like, we're going to try, and we're going to fight, and we're going to keep on doing it so that people know that, we're here, and until hopefully a better time comes. Just kind of a few more questions for you. Now, this is, for me, I think, quite a women-focused book. Obviously, it's called Young Women. It's mainly about women. But I'm intrigued, how do we include men? Because they have to be allies. In order for us to win, everyone needs to become a feminist. So how can we use your ideas to kind of include everyone?
I think it's very obvious that feminism is good for men.
I mean, yes. I know, but some people don't get that.
I think it's very obvious that if let's take friendship. If men are allowed to have close friendships because they're not worried about being perceived as gay, then that's obviously good for men, isn't it? If men are allowed to treat the women in their lives as valued equals rather than sort of either like screaming harpies or precious flowers, then that's better for them. If men spend time with their children, that is better for men. It's interesting, like I'm a member of the Women's Equality Party, and they go around and canvass and talk to a lot of men, and men say, well, I don't think that women, I think that you need to think about men's issues as well, because men don't get to spend any time with their children. Well, yeah, if there was better childcare, then, and if paternity leave were equal, then men would, and that would be enriching. So I think, in my opinion, it's an easy sell. I think it's very easy to get caught up in the idea that there's a zero-sum game, and that every advancement for women is a loss for men. But I don't really understand why people believe that.
Do people believe that?
I think there are some that do, and I really think there are some that do, and it's like in the same way that it's clear that we would all benefit from a world that was more equal in other ways. Like, clearly, if you know, we reduce homophobia, everyone benefits. If we reduce racial inequality, like, to me, it's clear that everyone benefits, because you don't have to spend all your time like in this constant, I don't know, status anxiety, or like trying to maintain.
Just constant hate, I feel, right?
Yeah.
Like, how tiring to hate all the time.
Yeah. So I think it's it should be straightforward. I think that there are some people who are doing good work on this. I really like Robert Webb's book, How Not to Be a Boy, because he talks about, you know, the way that his father sort of perceived him to fail at masculinity, and he was bisexual and had relationships with men. But he also talks about how that rage that he felt, and the way that was kind of turned outwards, like that had a negative, he was just taking all his emotions out on the women in his life. So he took responsibility, and, you know, maybe that's a little bit of what we need. Maybe some taking responsibility would be good. Because often, you know, when you say, well, men need feminism too, it gets quite knee-jerk, and we know that men have problems too. Nobody's saying they don't. But some responsibility would be probably a starting point. You can't heal from any conflict till you've taken responsibility for your part in it.
And gosh, we have touched upon this throughout the whole of the discussion, but I guess just some kind of key points, really. Like, finally, what influence, what do you want people to take away from this book?
I'm always kind of hesitant, because I feel like that's up to them. Like, my job is to tell the story, and their job is to decide what they make of it. Like, if people read the book as you have, like, you know, generously and thoughtfully, then you know, hopefully they'll have thought a little bit about why other people make the choices they do. I guess, want people to think about that idea of responsibility, but they might think about it and disagree with me, and that's fine. You know, I'm not in the business of telling people what to do. I want people to be curious and be interested in other people's lives, and think deeply about, you know, why we are the way we are.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Is Young Women, Jessica Moor. Thank you so much to our wine partners as well, Catena. I've been Aleesha Hansel. Enjoy the book, enjoy the wine. Cheers.
Cheers.